If you lie to the government, they'll put you in prison. But when they lie to all of us, it's called being a politician. You think taking guns away will save our kids from the killings? But you're pro-choice, abortion kills way more children. If America's so terrible and racist, it probably isn't safe to encourage immigration. Just saying, all the contradictions are embarrassing. You know who hates America the most? Americans. But we are all the same. We are red, white, and blue. Ashamed to be American? Okay, that's cool. Because honestly, we are all ashamed of you too.
Y'all are so fake. Oh no. The forecast said that there'd be snowflakes. Whoa.
And welcome back to Wide Right Turn. Just Blame Joey Live, bringing you a whole new season. It is season 2 here. Kicking off 2025 the right way. Going to be sitting down once again with Tom Kelly, talking about a few things, but we are in a real interesting position right now, less than 2 weeks before the legislative session starts. And a lot of people think, well, they're not started yet, so nothing's happening. Au contraire, a lot of work going on, a lot of conversations going on. We're going to talk to Tom Kelly about some of the things he's been hearing, some of the things that he's been asked, and some of the information he's been getting about what's coming up. So, Tom, welcome back. Happy 2025, bud.
Thank you. Happy New Year, Joey. Happy New Year, Just Blame Joey listeners. Glad everybody's here. Glad anyone listens to me. As a parent of teenagers, sometimes it's something we really miss out on. It's been very busy since the primary election, actually, and definitely since the general election. Contacts from interest groups, from people in positions of power, from people who work nonprofits, getting from other legislators. People are maneuvering all over the place. I mean, we're looking at going into session, having to filter through almost 600 bills. For those who don't want government sticking their nose too much into your lives, that can sound pretty daunting about how many potential new laws are sitting out there right now. But what are the ones that I've really heard from people recently? I've gotten phone calls, I've gotten text, I've gotten emails, I even got a handwritten letter to my house, are proponents of the Convention of States. So as far as Convention of States goes, I've been speaking to people about that, well, since before I even decided to run for office, to run for the House, because it's a really interesting concept. For those who, I'm sure your listeners know this, but if anyone's new and you don't know what the Convention of States is, the United States Constitution came with some self-correcting mechanisms. The amendment processes, well, only one's ever been used to its fruition. Amendments to the Constitution have only been brought about through the legislature passing amendments, 2/3 majority, and then 3/4 of the states ratifying. But there is an alternative method, and that is 2/3 of the states can call a convention to amend the Constitution. Now, that's not the same as calling a constitutional convention. It's not to write a new constitution. It's a method written within the Constitution saying this is another way to amend the Constitution if for some reason the Congress is refusing to do what the people want. So right there, you can see where that's attractive, because we've seen our federal government grow grossly out of control over the generations. We've seen the 10th Amendment, the one that says pretty much if we have not enumerated the powers in the Constitution, the federal government cannot do it. Yet, through some twisting of the General Welfare Clause and the Commerce Clause, we have all sorts of federal programs and laws that were never meant to be in the first place. So we have a federal government that has badly outgrown the original confines in the intent of the Constitution as a federal republic. Somebody like me who's got libertarian leanings, you could see why this would be an attractive endeavor for me. When you see career politicians who would never give themselves term limits, they would never vote away their own careers. They're never going to vote to limit how much power they have because they've worked their whole lives to get there and get that type of power. The Convention of States looks like that's the end run around the politicians. That's the way to go to do things here. And sometimes we could look and see if something's a good or bad idea based on who's for it and who's against it. Excuse me, I cleared my throat there. I forget how many states there are right now, but it's a couple dozen. They need 34. state legislatures to call for a convention of states to bring some things in there. And some of the groups that are against it are Common Cause, the League of Women Voters, the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. These are nonprofit groups. And those of us who are adept in political science know that typically when a nonpartisan policy group is out there, it's almost always liberal. They call themselves nonpartisan. But these are all three liberal groups that I mentioned here, are very much against the Convention of States. Now, some of the people who've come out in favor of it, Greg Abbott, Charlie Kirk, Sean Hannity, Senator Rand Paul, Rep. Chip Roy, Vivek Ramaswamy, Governor Ron DeSantis, Ben Shapiro, Marco Rubio, Mark Levine, even James O'Keefe. These are all some conservative heavy hitters right now in both the Make America Great movement and more of the libertarian stance, such as somebody like is Rand Paul. Common Cause is very much against it. I looked at their website, and they come out against it saying, quote, mega donors, corporations, the radical far-right actors are pushing calls for an Article 5 convention in states across the country to rewrite the U.S. Constitution for their own benefit. Frighteningly, they're just a few states away from succeeding. Under Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution, Congress is required to hold a constitutional convention if 2/3 of state legislatures, 34 states, call for one. But there is a catch. There are absolutely no rules for an Article 5 convention outlined in the Constitution. That means the group of people convening to revise our country's core legal document could be totally unelected and unaccountable. There's no way to limit the convention to a single issue, so delegates could write amendments that revoke any of our most cherished rights, like our right to peaceful protest, our freedom of religion, or our right to privacy. Right now, there are 4 major campaigns for an Article 4 convention, and each has a different set of goals, but together they have convinced 28 states to call for a convention. That means they just have 6 states to go, which is why we are stopping an Article 5 convention by ramping up our efforts to reject and rescind calls in states nationwide. So Common Cause, a left-leaning, nonpartisan group, is very much against it, and they're using loaded political language. The far right, which I am now part of, not by just guilt by association, I guess. And then these fears of a runaway convention, they call it a constitutional convention, but that's not necessarily true. But looks here, they say 28 states. I was saying a couple dozen or so. Looking on the other side of it, we see the Heritage Foundation. The Heritage Foundation is very much in favor of it. They actually went back and forth and reconsidered. And they said, the fact that there's never been a convention of states called to propose amendments to the Constitution means that most Americans are unaware that we, the people, have this power and need not rely on Congress to initiate the amendment process. This lack of familiarity with the Convention of States option for proposing constitutional amendments is a problem for our republic because it creates a strong inertia against the people's use of Article 5 as the potent check on federal power that the framers envisioned it would be. It also creates uncertainty and doubt about how such a convention would work in practice. So they're holding it up. This is a great idea to get the federal government under control. And the opponents of it are putting in fears there of our rights being stripped away, that the far right would come in and take away rights to privacy. What they meant by that was right to abortion, because there is no right to privacy in the Constitution. If anything, the Convention of States could actually add it. But why is this needed, though? What are we talking about when we say that the government is out of control? Well, here are some of the things like the Heritage Foundation says these 3 points. Number 1, fiscal restraints on the federal government. And why would we say this? Well, the United States is currently about $36 trillion in debt. Correction. The federal government is $36 trillion in debt. You throw in state and local governments, it's over $40 trillion of government debt now in the country. But we're talking about the federal government. The federal government has $222 trillion worth of unfunded liabilities. That means promises to Social Security, promises to Medicare that we don't know how we're going to pay for. Now, to put in perspective how large $222 trillion is, the United States currently is estimated to have $221 trillion in total assets. The entire value of the United States is $221 trillion, and we're estimated to already owe $222 trillion. Just put that into effect, how out of control spending is. And if you look forward, if we go to like usdebtclock.org, they've got algorithms on there where you can see if we keep spending at current levels without an expansion of government, if we just keep hold things steady, that by 2028, we will be $51 trillion in debt and have $300 trillion in unfunded liabilities. It's completely unsustainable. The dollar has to collapse at some point under a fiat currency like this. BRICS nations are looking for alternative currencies as we just print the dollar to death. So that's one issue, fiscal restraint on the government. The other is limits on the jurisdiction of federal legislative, executive, and judicial branches. We have seen federal overreach, particularly the executive branch. As the legislature has abdicated a whole bunch of their legislative authority to the presidency, who makes up these massive departments, like the Department of Education. Maybe we'll actually get rid of that this time. It's only been around since 1979. I'm 10 years older than the Department of Education. But these massive federal bureaucracies have rulemaking abilities, like the EPA, like the Department of Labor, like the Department of Energy, and they start doing things like making rules about the type of mileage your car has to get, or how energy efficient your air conditioner can be. These are not laws of the people by the people. They are from unelected and unaccountable bureaucrats. We also have overreach from the judicial branch, where laws are passed by the people's branch. That's the legislative branch. That's where we pick our representatives in the republic. We don't even get to pick our president. We pick our electors to choose the president. The states choose the president. Then the executive picks the judicial branch. And then the judicial branch, quite often, as we've seen at a state level recently, a single judge can overturn the will of the people by claiming something is unconstitutional, which is their job, except when they do what we call legislating from the bench, and they start doing things like, say, writing edicts that demand the legislature spend a certain amount of money. That's called judicial overreach. The third point the Heritage Foundation has, term limits for members of the federal legislative and judicial branches. Now, I'm not a fan of term limits for judicial branches. A lifetime appointment, that's served well for the most part. There are methods to impeach judges that are out of control. We just don't use them. But for Congress, I am a strong proponent of term limits for Congress. I used to think we had what we called elections, and that would get rid of people when we didn't want them anymore. But the United States House of Representatives is so badly gerrymandered that even this last time around, where we had a massive red wave across the country, county after county shifted from blue to red. Many states shifted from blue to red. Many Senate seats shifted from blue to red. Somehow the Democrats picked up one seat in the House of Representatives during a red tidal wave. That's gerrymandering. That's the only answer to it. Well, they might have stolen a couple of House seats 3 weeks later in California. They did ballots just keep trickling in for weeks so the Democrats ahead. We know that can work in California. But nonetheless, there wasn't a big wave of red seats. And we also saw that in 2022, even though the polls were pointing towards the Republican Party, that Republicans didn't pick up as many seats as we thought. Severe gerrymandering. and it makes it almost impossible to beat an incumbent in Congress. I mean, an incumbent has to become as universally hated as Liz Cheney to get bounced, typically, once they're in there. Otherwise, they're in there as long as they'd like to be in there. So that's the basics I have it from the beginning. There are some really good points about some changes we should possibly make to the United States. Now, I've got this from, I think this might be from the government of Kentucky. Doesn't really matter. It's called the Balanced Budget Amendment Task Force. And when they were looking to vote on it, they had this thing they said, 10 facts to rebut the mythology of a runaway convention. Because the biggest opposition I've seen to a convention of states has been the runaway convention, where they go there to just balance the budget and have term limits, and that's it. But suddenly we're making trades the right of privacy. We're rewriting the Second Amendment. There's a right to health care put in there by the state of Illinois who's looking to pass this. That's the biggest fear right now, is that we could not limit the convention. Here are some of the rebuttals to those fears of that. I'm just quoting from this here, and I'm not going to read all 10. I'm going to get through about 7 of them, but these are all worth mentioning. Number 1, Article 5 does not authorize a constitutional convention. It authorizes a convention for proposing specific amendments only. So common cause is wrong. It's not calling for a new constitution. It's not like the Constitutional Convention that led to what we have today, that replaced the Articles of Confederation. It is a process written into the Constitution, not to get rid of it, but to amend it. Number 2, when the founders drafted the U.S. Constitution, they specifically rejected language for Article 5 that would have allowed the states to later call for an open convention. Number 3, 38 states must ratify any proposal from an amendments convention, requiring a broad consensus that makes sure amendments cannot run away. The convention can't run away, because even if they do pass a runaway, if a bunch of amendments are passed that nobody wanted, 38 states still have to ratify them. Otherwise, they're meaningless anyway. 37 states say they've signed on to the runaway convention, then they all die anyway. So we don't have to worry about that just from there, because 3/4 of the states would have to ratify a runaway convention. Number 4, the limited scope of an amendments convention is underscored by the fact that it specifically says amendments cannot alter the equal number of votes for each state in the U.S. Senate without consent of the affected state. This establishes that an Article 5 convention couldn't simply rewrite the entire Constitution. Number 5, the states define the agenda of an amendments convention through their applications for the convention and through the Commission of Delegates. Amendments conventions can be limited to specific topics, and that's how this is being presented here. Number 6, the Constitution was sold by the founders to the ratifying states on the basis that they retain their ultimate authority over the federal government through their Article 5 amendment powers. And 7, there is zero precedent that any convention of the states has ever run away from its assigned agenda. There have been 12 interstate conventions in the history of the United States. All of them stayed within their stated agenda. Even the Constitutional Convention of 1787 did what it was charged to do. So the fear of a runaway convention just really isn't founded. I mean, there's a definite fear. I'm not saying people don't feel like that, but even if they were to go in there and run away with their ideas, it would have to be ratified by all the 3/4 of the states, like I said before. I've heard some people in Wyoming say, well, we've called a special session, like in Wyoming, for just like a couple things, and then a whole bunch of other things got thrown in there. But what the state didn't have to be ratified by 3/4 of the counties in the state. Otherwise, it probably would have fell on its face. That's a stipulation in the Convention of States that wasn't in the runaway special session that Wyoming saw. So there are two different animals there. It's really apples and oranges. So again, 34 states must call the convention. 38 states must ratify each amendment. And I've got this last part I'd like to go over about giving the backdrop on this. I know I'm going really long here, but this is really important to get to my final point, that everyone understands that I get what the convention is. I understand the arguments for it. and I understand the need for it. This is actually from the state of Kentucky. I forgot what the other state was I read that from, but I should cite my sources, but it's a podcast, right? I'm not publishing here. These are some of the types of amendments that could be proposed. First of all, a balanced budget amendment. And that makes sense. That makes sense to an extent, considering how much debt we're in. And we've become used to, as voters, asking the government, or demanding, or some people say fighting for, free stuff from the government that somebody else pays for, but we don't want to pay taxes. So instead of raising taxes to pay for the new programs, they just print new dollars to pay for the programs, and then we put it on our tab. Another one would be the imposition of generally accepted accounting principles for government accounting. That's a good idea too. Help keep our dollar amount straight. Number 3, a single subject amendment limiting congressional bills to a single subject. I mean, that's something we have in Wyoming. The bills have to be a single subject. Again, a good idea. Redefinition of the general welfare clause, redefinition of a commerce clause to pull the reins of the government, where we had some legislating from the bench where judges decided that some programs that clearly go outside the scope of Amendment 10 didn't, because they loosely tied them to either the general welfare clause or the commerce clause. Some of these bills that get passed say just in the interest of interstate commerce, and then they pass a Violence Against Women Act. Even you can't see how the two are really closely related. Another idea is the prohibition on using international treaties and law to govern domestic law of the United States, because sometimes we've actually had like a Supreme Court justice quote international law and making a decision about the United States Constitution. And for those of us who love the United States and love the United States Constitution, have a deep reverence for the men who put it together, it's abhorrent to think that somebody on the Supreme Court would make a decision based on what we do in the United States based on international law. They also possibly a limitation on using executive orders and federal regulations. We already know about federal overreach in the executive branch. An upper limit on federal taxation. We're to a point now where in some states that the upper limit of income is paying a majority of every dollar they earn to the state, federal, and local governments. Requiring a supermajority for tax increases. I love that idea. You just can't get a simple majority to raise taxes on people. A religious freedom amendment prohibiting the government from further interference in religious freedoms, and regulatory curtailment forcing Congress to vote on regulations instead of just deferring the law to the regulators. Again, I like that one too. Congress is not going to want to pass so many damn rules if they've got to sit down and discuss and vote on all of them. Not just say, let's create a new department, hire a bunch of bureaucrats, and then they'll use AI to write the rules for them. Oddly, on the Kentucky one, there was no mention of term limits on there, because that was one of the huge ones for the Convention of States, and that's one of the reasons where it makes sense to me to use the Convention of States if we were going to amend the Constitution. Now, imagine the United States with a severely restricted federal government in terms of about power and finance. One of the proponents, one of the founders of the Convention of States movement is Michael Ferris. And this guy's a luminary scholar. He's brilliant. He's got an astounding knowledge of history, law, and the Constitution. I couldn't hold his jockstrap when it comes to that. He knows so much more than I ever will. Arguments against the Convention of States by men like him have been absolutely eviscerated. The runaway convention, not realistic. It's just not going to happen. It couldn't. Even if it did, then the garbage that comes out of it doesn't get ratified anyway. So the convention can succeed just as those proponents want, just as they predict. And that reveals their astounding blind spot in the reality of politics. And this is why the political hill I'll die on is killing the Convention of States. Because this could succeed just as they envision. But the unintended consequences, they've got a giant blind spot. No government stands without continuous and widespread public support. Most Americans do not want the American vision by the Convention of State Proponents. We're talking about a severely limited federal government, back to the ideas of the founders, where states are in control of their own business, where we get rid of all these massive departments making all these rules, where we get rid of massive government programs like the ACA, where we get rid of the Department of Education, basically having the National Education Association Union, which is a Marxist group, pushing their crap through the public schools with their captive audiences. The version of the United States, and this is why Convention of States was so attractive to me. I would love to see the United States with this liberty-minded small government, just leave people alone and let us help one another. That is my viewpoint of the world. But we have to look at the reality of where the United States is right now, because we didn't get here overnight. And we can't simply write new rules to get out of it overnight. Last I checked, I looked at some of these numbers to make sure 60%, almost 60% of Americans want the government to provide universal health care. 72% of Democrats want a purely government-run system like Canada. And then that is across the board in the United States. Look at California. 2/3 of California, the biggest state in the country, regardless of party, want state health care for all. There's similar numbers in New York. They favor the feds implementing it, though, because obviously the feds can print money. California's tried to do their own state-run system. It wasn't going to work because they can't borrow money the way the feds can. The grand scheme of things, 48% of voters voted for Kamala Harris, the most left-wing senator probably in American history. On all the Senate rating sites, before Google scrubbed them before the election, when they put forth this attempted mirage that she was a moderate senator, when we ranked from the most freedom-loving to the most freedom-hating senators, Bernie Sanders was 99. Kamala Harris was number 100. The most hardcore, red-blooded communist we've ever had run for the United States federal executive branch. Half the country wanted this person in control. Now, why does that matter? We have a balanced budget amendment, a limit on taxation, a redefinition of the Commerce Clause, and the practical implications are you end Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, the Affordable Care Act. Now, in some ways, if I could wave a magic wand and we could have a private retirement system instead of the big government boondoggle, that would be great on paper. But think of the practical implications when you tell tens of millions of people that the Social Security system they've paid into all this time is no longer constitutional. Think of the upheaval of trying to force this libertarian, that's basically what it is. It's not even conservative, a libertarian limited government proposal when half the country not only doesn't want it, the majority doesn't want a government that limited, but when almost half the country wants a national social democracy. Not only do they not want a limited federal government, not only are they okay with how large the government is now, 48% of people just this year voted for national health care, a national gun ban, mandatory vaccines, all the horrific things we would never, ever want. And all I see, if the Convention of States actually succeeded, is the dissolution of the United States. Because there's no way states that voted 2/3 for a communist would ever sign on to this. And if people say, well, then, Tom, you don't have to worry about it, then it was all just wasted effort anyway. Why put all this time and effort into something where, one, it won't succeed, or two, if it does, that would be even worse. So That's a half an hour of me going not straight. So I'm just going to take a deep breath here. And I'm sure at some point you had a whole bunch of things you wanted to jump in and say, but I'll tag on this. I know some people are going to be upset with me. They're going to be like, you want this runaway government. You don't love liberty. Oh, yes, I do. I love this country. And I know that it took us generations to dig into this hole. And it's going to take us generations to reverse direction, starting now with the Department of Government Efficiency to start digging our way out and start digging our way out state by state like we're going to do here in Wyoming. But we have to change culture. We just can't force this way of thinking on a country where half the people definitely don't want it.
Well, there's a lot in there. You're right. I've got copious notes, and hopefully I can follow them because they're written all over this piece of paper. I'm going to start where I ended last time we talked about Convention of States, and I said it to kind of cover what I was saying. So now I'll say it up front. I love my country, and I am ashamed of my government. Our problem is not with the nation. It is not with the Constitution. It's not with the structure of America on paper. It's with what people have decided to do or chosen and gotten away with ignoring and not following in the way the nation is structured. So I'm going to start there, which is one of my arguments with the Convention of States. Why change a rule in a document that nobody's following? Let's give the Constitution an honest shot first and enforce it and then see about changing it. But there's a lot of other things that you said in there, and I'm going to go specifically to what Article 5 says and kind of break it down. Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution says the Congress, whenever 2/3 of both houses deem it necessary, shall propose amendments to this Constitution, or on the application of the legislature of 2/3 of the several states shall call a convention for proposing amendments, in which either case shall be valid to all intents, purposes, and content of this Constitution when ratified by the legislature of 3/4 of the several states, or by conventions in 3/4 thereof, as one or the other mode of ratification may be proposed by Congress, provided that no amendment which may be made any manner affect the first and fourth clauses in the 9th section of the first article. The first and fourth clauses in that section are about states being allowed to import or bring in population to gain statehood, and that there should be no taxes applied to any articles exported from a state. Those are the only rules and restrictions in Article 5, whether Congress makes amendments or conventions propose amendments. Those are the only rules. So everything else other than the statement the guy made in his 10-point list of the convention is only for proposing amendments, there's nothing backing it up. And I will use the example that you kind of poo-pooed. We did have a special session here in 2021, and it was proposed that we meet to discuss these things for this length of time. And I'm not saying it was a runaway or a whole bunch of other things were added. I'm saying what was proposed was immediately changed upon the seating of that session, and they discussed the rules. They did not agree on the rules under the guises of what was proposed to have happened. And it's not my concern that it's going to be a runaway convention and they're going to take our guns and it's going to be automatic coming out of the convention. The Constitution's been changed. I know that's not how it works, but they can still use all these other things as fulcrums to leverage things they want to get done or as roadblocks to stop other things. So in my mind, the runaway convention automatically changing the Constitution and stripping us. You're right. I don't have that concern, but I do have the concern that the way Congress operates now, because they don't have single item legislative requirements, that things can be bonded together, weighed against each other, used against each other. Oh, okay. Well, if you want this, then we have to talk about that. And I just read the entirety of Article 5. Nobody can argue that things like your first, second, fourth, fifth through eighth amendments, all your due process rights, state rights, and the basic construct of government. It's not just the amendments they're allowed to talk about. All of those could be on the table. They could be used as bargaining chips. They could be weaponized for other ideas to come through. People say, no. It says you can only propose amendments, which means you can only add things. You got the Bill of Rights, and then you got all the way up to 27. Well, that's not what the word amendment means. Looking at Merriam-Webster's dictionary, the word to amend is to change or modify and alter, especially in content or phraseology. To alter formally by modification, deletion, or addition. So Article 5 doesn't say you have to propose singular amendments and add it, number 28, moving on each item on its own. You can go all the way back into Article 1 and change the way the presidency is structured. Maybe some people want that. You can change the way Congress, authorities of Congress, you can give more powers to the judiciary that aren't currently constitutional judiciary powers. So my concern is that those things could be present. They could be bargaining chips. People could broker certain concepts against others in a document that most of the people were really worried about and proposing to put more restraint on don't pay attention to already. That goes into term limits. Of course, I believe we have term limits every 2, 4, or 6 years, depending on when the election comes up. And if 48% of the country is really pissed off one way or the other and the rest of the people agree with them, at least on term limits, get up off your ass and go out and vote. Hold your legislators accountable. These people are not there to be your friends, and your vote is not a Valentine. And that's a real basic argument on term limits, but it doesn't make it any less true. We have the ability to do that. And even if we got term limits, what are you going to have? You think having term limits is going to automatically produce better candidates in the future? No. It's going to accelerate the amount of horrific crap certain people do while they are training their replacement and preparing a long, deep bench behind them to continue to come in and work the machine. We already know how the power of incumbency and endorsement and coronation or the ascent of the heir apparent happens. So I don't see term limits as a valid reason to go outside of the congressional process. You have members in Congress that want term limits right now. Let's bring it as a single item, amend the Constitution that way, and not have it lay in a position where it can be fulcrumed or weighted, balanced against some other idea. The one that really gets me is the balanced budget argument. There is no constitutional provision that we even have a budget. If there was, then we would have a budget every year and we could have this argument better. The only thing in the Constitution under the duties of Congress is they have the right to borrow money against the credit of the United States, and they have the right to print money. There's nothing saying they need a budget. And in fact, the last time we actually had a budget passed in the United States prior to the fiscal year starting was 1997. And only 4 times since the United States has been in existence have we had a budget passed before that fiscal year started. 1997, 1995 were big ones because those are both under Clinton. I'm not a huge fan of them, but he did pass a balanced budget that took effect in 1996. And it was pretty much the last time we did it. The aftermath of that, 1997, got passed in time. But ever since 1997, there's either been late budgets or what we've had more recently, no budget at all and just working off of continuing resolutions. The last budget that was passed in the United States was in 2019, Trump's last budget, February 15th, 2019. That was a budget. It was passed after the fiscal year started, but we at least had a budget. Since then, it's been all continuing resolutions. So what's the point of having a constitutional amendment saying you must have a balanced budget if there's no constitutional provision saying you have to have a budget at all and nothing that doesn't restrict these continuing resolutions? So I get the intent. I understand the spirit, but a lot of the arguments I've heard are very poorly thought out. Government overreach. Okay, I get it. Bureaucratic enforcement of laws that aren't laws is ridiculous because Congress has ceded a bunch of power to the executive. Until we start changing the butts in the seats, it doesn't matter what the Constitution says because these are already powers of Congress laid out in the Constitution that they're ignoring and handing over. Same thing with judicial overreach. The judicial branch is not allowed to legislate from the bench. They're not supposed to be activist judges. We are not supposed to allow something called judicial relief. If we have a law in the state that the U.S. Supreme Court says is unconstitutional, it should trigger legislative action in Wyoming. Mandatorily. We have to follow what the court says because it's unconstitutional or fight the court or refuse to do it. Refuse to change the law, refuse to follow the court's decision. It's actually one of the planks in the Wyoming Republican Party platform. Just because a court says something is unconstitutional does not change our Constitution or our laws. So until we can get into the posture and the regular motions of reacting appropriately to when this stuff does happen, there's no point in changing the Constitution at all. And I still try to look at it from the founder's point of view, but I think one of the, I don't want to say missteps, but maybe a little folly in your 48% of the country supports socialism and all. No, they wanted to vote for a socialist because for some reason, amongst many reasons, they don't like Donald Trump. They don't like Republicans. Maybe a lot of them are communists and socialists and do want the federal government, but I don't think it's a homogeny. I think it's a lot of idiocy. I think it's a lot of laziness. It's a lot of selfishness. There's some people that just want to see a woman be president. So I don't think all of those votes were for all of these things that Kamala Harris stood for. I don't think enough of those people are that savvy. But that's kind of hard for us to look at and say, well, how can they not know? All the information is right there. But I really don't believe that 48% of the country, or even more when it comes to some specific topics, are so unified in that belief that they want to run headlong into it.
That's a fair point. Some of the things I was thinking of, I didn't even get into it. The whole idea that, let's say that the convention is successful, gets these amendments into place, and the United States stays together, and the states that are overwhelmingly against and grudgingly go along because it's better to be part of the United States than to be an independent country or to go to war or whatever. It's the idea that, like you had said, when we're already not following the rule book, that adding more rules to it will get people to follow along. And the best way I could explain this to people who are more conservative, it's gun control logic they're using. Gun control advocates say, wow, look at these shootings. People are disobeying these laws on shooting people. We need more gun laws. And we have people saying, well, look at this, Amendment 9, Amendment 10, these limitations on government. The federal government is ignoring these rules. We need more rules for them to abide by it. The idea of, let's say that they successfully redefined the Commerce Clause, so all those laws became unconstitutional. Well, let's be real about this. We have a member of the Supreme Court who's a woman who can't tell you what a woman is. If we have that in our judiciary right now, it doesn't matter how tightly written our new definition of general welfare and commerce are, we will have activist judges at that point play the new amendments, play the new constitutional additions like an accordion till it makes the sound that they want. And the programs that they want will still be in the place. We have many people already in the judiciary who really don't care what the intent of the Constitution was. They just, like I said, they just play it like a flute till it makes the notes they want to justify whatever their ideological standpoint is. So rewording that document, it would be just kind of like retuning a guitar, maybe adding an extra string to it, and they would still fiddle around with it till it played the notes that they wanted at that point. So I don't even see how changing the rule book will make people follow the rules they already ignore. I don't see that at all. But my biggest concern, again, is not that the Constitution failed, the Convention of States fails. My biggest concern is that it succeeds exactly as they envisioned.
And to stay with your guitar analogy there, doing any of that doesn't make you a better guitar player either. It's not going to make the government, the people that work in government, or the people that have been elected into government any better. In fact, I think it's the opposite. I've talked to a lot of people, and they seem to believe it's a magic wand. Well, if we put this rule in the Constitution, then everything automatically gets fixed. And I'm telling you, I've said it before, constitutional liberty is something that has to be constantly practiced, tested, utilized, and protected on a daily basis. Otherwise, you don't understand it. And that's what was bringing me to my earlier point was candidates and legislators who are in favor of the Convention of States or even ballot initiatives. That is a step around, a completely legal and constitutional step around, but it is still a step around our representative republic process. You're a legislator now. And before you've ever sat down at your desk or sworn into your office, you're still saying, I think the way we do it is wrong and it needs to be left up to this other system. Okay, first of all, then why'd you run as a legislator? Second of all, what are you about to learn? You don't know because you haven't learned it yet. When you hit the floor about the process of governance. So I got an issue with people who are running for office or in office that fully support or actively participate in these alternative methods of governing because it is another way for Congress or our state legislator to cede their authority and their responsibilities. Oh, but it's better because it's the people's voice. And hey, so was your election to office. You need to be able to get in there with better ideas, have better arguments, learn how to build coalitions with people that may not agree with you or that you don't like to get this work done. Because when I see a legislator saying, you know what, in order to fix all our problems, all we need is a convention of state or a ballot initiative going out to all the voters so they can tell us exactly what they want and it can't be changed and then everything will be perfect. Well, then we don't need you. You're telling me you don't have good enough ideas, good enough arguments, or the energy to go in there and fight through just a 40-day session and come out somewhat successful, or at least learn how to be successful in the next session? Come on. Again, it's not a magic wand. It's just another thing, like you said, they'll find a way around, they'll find a way to ignore, and unless we're actively practicing, protecting, and enforcing those provisions, those rules, those guardrails equally and universally, none of this, just because you're Dan Zwanitzer, you're not going to get prosecuted for something we prosecute any other non-legislative representative for. We have to do it all. We have to do it constantly. And I get why people are sick of politics. They don't want to talk about it. They don't want to deal with it. It's too confusing. I understand. But the people that do want to talk about politics, the people that do want to be in politics, the people that ran for office, got elected, I have a concern down to the fundamental functions of government and you as a legislative representative with you saying, I really like the idea of this stepping out of our representative form of government, which is currently my job to make these laws, improve these laws, and make sure these laws are enforced as they were intended. It's a big piece of heartburn for me.
Point of not following the rules. Because when I say that the Convention of States for a balanced budget amendment would fail, people would typically, you don't want to pass some new law, pass some new form of coercion to make people behave the way people think they should behave. You're somehow tacitly or outrightly endorsing that type of behavior. Like, since I think a balanced budget amendment is a waste of time, well, you think this debt's a good thing. No, it's going to be the death of the country, if anything, collapsing our economy by just destroying our own currency. But I looked it up, and every state except for Vermont has a balanced budget provision in their constitution. And every state is in debt. So obviously balanced budget amendments don't work as promised because there would be no debt if these states actually balance their budgets. Or I was looking into other places where we look at rules if there's no method of enforcement. And self-governance is to contact and active sport, people. I mean, Rod Miller and I will agree on that. We don't agree on policies, but we agree that if you want to change something, you have to get in there and be active. If you want a balanced budget, you've got to elect people who will balance the budget, not elect people who say they're going to pass another rule that says we're supposed to balance the budget. And if people don't want to believe me on that standpoint, the Constitution of Russia guarantees the right to free speech and freedom of the press. There's no free speech and freedom of the press in Russia. People don't stand up for it there. Everybody knows it's a fascist dictatorship. But it's written in there. It says it right in their constitution. I wonder if there are people in Russia saying, we need to change the constitution. We need our freedom of speech back. We'll rewrite the wording of the constitution and then we'll have our rights back. That's not how it works. So we don't reword the constitution and then bring back the principles that have faded away over the generations. And quite frankly, and I don't mean to insult anyone at this time, but I inadvertently do all the time. I really, really don't trust that my generation, the people of today, I don't think we're smarter than Franklin and Madison and Jefferson and Adams. I don't trust that, considering what they created in the 18th century, it's the longest surviving governmental constitution in modern history, in human history, for all I know on that. They built it with some fantastic mechanisms so it does adapt with the times. When people say you want to go back to the 18th century, no, that doesn't mean women can't vote and you have slaves. It means the Constitution was changed as it needed to be changed. And for those saying that we need to change it further, and we're not getting the amendments through, so we need to take a different tack to get the amendments through, I would challenge you to explain to me how, again, rewriting the rules will affect the people who already ignore the rule book.
I do believe there are a lot of people, maybe not the percentage you spoke to, but there are a lot of people that think it would be great to have a fully socialist society where the government does everything for you. And I say let them have it. You want to know? And I don't mean do this to America, but experience it and then come back and say it was still a good idea. Because the thing that the founders had that we don't have is the benefit of the life experience living under a tyrannical monarchy. They saw firsthand. This is why we seem so smart. All we're doing is being pretty smart guys who are saying, that can't happen. How do we word this so that it's very hard to let that happen ever again? It kind of goes hand in glove with you at least have to trust. If you can't say, oh, they could see into the future, they probably couldn't, but they were also aware of the puckle gun. So anybody complaining, oh, they didn't understand rapid fire weapons, you're wrong. But they also had real life experience with the thing. Almost everything in the Constitution exists to try to avoid. Half of it's about prosperity and the other half is about avoiding and getting prepared to fight against tyranny. I think anybody that wants that free government, whatever, hey, just go live in Russia for a while, like you said. Go down and live in Venezuela for a while. Get a piece of what you want and then come back and say it's a good idea. Or come back and maybe appear smarter because you now have that life experience. You have that knowledge of saying, oh, no, now I know why these are bad things. It just didn't really work out well for me. That's kind of what I try to go to when people try to downplay the brilliance of the founders. It really wasn't an argument. These were really smart guys of their time. And even if they were around today, they'd come up with stuff we probably couldn't possibly fathom that would work because they would have the experience of what living today is. But it's from their experience back then, actually dealing with a monarchy, a tyrannical government who wanted to rule from thousands of miles away and then defeating the strongest standing army and navy in the world at the time with a bunch of farmers. Yeah, I don't like people downplaying the founders and their abilities, their life experience, and what it means to us today. But you're right. I can't tell you he was a real smart guy. I can tell you he has experiences that putting his life, name, and fortune at risk, which almost all the founders did and lost, provided me an opportunity to not have to have that firsthand knowledge. And I can at least appreciate that.
Well, I know that some people are not very much excited about people who don't have solutions to the problems they see. And then on top of it, poo-poo on the solutions that they bring. But we don't have another hour right now because people would say at this point, okay, so if you agree these are problems, Tom, what would be your recommendation to fix them? And I'll just preview what we could be talking about in the very near future. And thankfully, I'm on the education committee, is breaking the government monopoly of government schools, which has trained generation after generation of people that debt and government power, and we have leaders and not civil servants. Just the world view that government is the solution has been taught to generations, and it needs to be untaught. And free market education is the way to do that rather than government dominance. But I can't get into all the details of that right now because it just sounds like a simplistic cure-all, but there is a lot of thought process behind it because I fully understand the mess and the historical jeopardy that the United States is currently in. And it's almost like, in a way, the United States economy, if it was a brain, we've got a malignant brain tumor that's growing. And the Convention of States is, we'll just cut the damn thing out with a chainsaw, and you'll kill the patient in the process. There's a much better way to work out the issue without killing the patient.
I would agree. And I do have that pet peeve of don't poo-poo a situation or point out a problem without a solution. I'm going to go back to what I said earlier. A lot of people who complain or even want a Convention of States are involved or not involved and just complain without real involvement. They've never read the Constitution. They don't know what's in there, but they want to change it. And I say, my answer is, let's give the Constitution a chance. Let's stand solid and say, absolutely not. This is what the Constitution says, and you're not allowed to do it anymore. And I know that doesn't change what Congress is going to do, but again, every 2, 4, and 6 years, we have elections. Stand to some principles. Say, you know what? We're not going to reelect you. We may elect somebody worse, but it's not going to be you again. That's the best I can do with what we've got right now, because I don't believe that walking into the Constitution page by page with a machete is the right idea, especially when everything's based on hope that your new rules are actually going to change something. Because again, it's not a magic wand. The Constitution's a toolbox. It's got lots of different individual implements in it, and you have to know how to apply them and pick the right one for the right job. And then remember, it's a toolbox. It all needs to be secured and protected and kept together and looked at in its entirety so that you know you have this entire complement of abilities and restrictions to make your project come out properly. But you're right. That's just about it for this hour. Maybe we'll get into it again next week. I don't know. We're going to come up pretty close to the session here in the next week or so. So we will keep you up to date with what we're going to be doing in season 2 here on Just Blame Joey Live. Definitely going to be more wide right turn coming your way, along with a few other things. You're just going to have to give me the time, do the transition into the session, move the studio to Cheyenne, and figure out what we're going to do. But Tom, thanks for being here again. And why don't you go ahead and close us out?
We'll be talking real soon, everybody. I'll try to keep up with this as we do this through the session. If not, my daughter and campaign manager, who's telling me she's going to be a U.S. Senator someday, so she's very much interested in joining some of these conversations. So she might even fill in for me time to time during session when I got my hands full, which I will.
Well, I definitely look forward to that. You know, from the mouths of babes, I did a lot of that during my Christmas episodes this last couple weeks. And I'll tell you what, the youth of America, it's not their future. It's their present. They got to get involved. Us old guys complain. Me and Chuck Gray being some of the youngest guys in Wyoming politics is a big problem for me. So maybe we'll get some of these younger people involved and get those shining stars up there in the sky. And until then, make sure you're keeping an eye out for me and Tom. We'll definitely be down in Cheyenne for those 40 days starting right around January 12th. Make that wide right turn on I-80 off into Cheyenne. And if you see me and Tom, say hi. And remember, we're not from the government, but we are here to help.
If you lie to the government, they'll put you in prison. But when they lie to all of us, it's called being a politician. You think taking guns away will save our kids from the killings, but you're pro-choice, abortion kills way more children. If America's so terrible and racist, it probably isn't safe to encourage immigration. Just saying, all the contradictions are embarrassing. You know who hates America the most? Americans. But we are all the same. We are red, white, and blue. Ashamed to be American? Okay, that's cool. Because honestly, we are all ashamed of you too.
Y'all are so fake. Oh no, the forecast said that there